I'm just going to give a little bit of a breakdown of why I think I should really be making this tier list anyway. Simply put, if you don't know my channel, I have about 100 kills on Malenia recorded with almost every weapon class you'll see in the video as we go. I'm missing one, but I will get to it eventually. Beyond that, I like to believe I'm actually pretty well practiced in the fight. I'm not just flailing whenever I fight her, most of the time at least. I actively practice her quite a bit, and I have a few dozen hours fighting her at this point. So I think that's a pretty good reason for why I can give a strong breakdown of this. Thank you for the watch. I'm going to now let it transition, etc. Have fun. Thanks. Howdy everybody, and welcome to something a little bit new today. First of all, check it out. I have a little splash screen. Beyond that, though, we're going to be covering a tier list today, and it's going to be basically the weapon classes against Malenia. We're going to get into it real quick. Let me just go ahead and transition. Let me show this off. It's kind of cool. And then we will get right into it. Okay, so here's our tier list. We have 5 tiers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can count. All right. And instead of doing like S tier to F tier or godly to trash as I have in the thumbnail, I'm actually going to be ranking them by like how situationally good they are. And with that, let's just get into it. Oh, the other thing to note, down in this little section off to the side on my recording, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not. It looks like maybe not, but I'm going to be hopefully including a pros and cons list of each weapon type as we get to it. We'll see. That might be something a little more complex that I'm used to. So for now, let's just get into it, shall we? It's going to be pretty straightforward. We're just going to pull from the first one. I made this myself. I made all the thumbnails myself. I basically just selected them in GIMP and then inverted the selection and took a picture and saved the image of the black and white selection. Anyway, let's get into it, shall we? So, to begin with, we just have axes. Axes are pretty good. There are 2 or 3 different movesets with it, but all 3 are rather good. Granted, the best moveset is going to be the short axe moveset, which will come with the Hoarfrost axe. Well, ooh, what is that thing called? You know the one I'm talking about. The Frost axe. And then like the Thrall axe and stuff. My goodness, the Imp Ash. The Imp axe. I cannot speak today. We'll get into it. I'm a little rusty on this sort of thing. I've not really done something like this, but anyway, what we're going to say is we're going to say that this is good in most situations. The issue with it is, so you get like 5 or 6 swings per combo, but you have the downside of rather short range, and the stagger timings to actually punish her properly are a little bit harder to get intuitively. But they have rather good stance damage as well, so they're pretty good altogether. Downsides, the range doesn't matter that much. You are not a lunging attack, which means you don't move very far forward during your attacks. But that's okay, because Malenia does anyway to make up for some of that. So they're pretty good still. Next up is going to be the Great Hammer. I think they're also good in most situations. The thing about them is that they trade off the 5 or 6 hits in a combo for 4, but having way better stance damage, and also having access to some of the better weapons in the game, such as the Great Stars, and as people rant about now, the Black Steel Great Hammer. They are shorter than Great Axes and lose out on the charged R2 aspect of Great Axes and the higher stance damage than that, but they're still pretty good. Downsides are, I mean, like, they're fine. There's nothing spectacular about them. They don't typically have bleed. Bleed being one of the best auxiliary effects, statuses that you can use on her. But even still, you have access to stuff like Great Stars and things like that. So I still think they're very good. Beyond that, next up, I'm going to go through these kind of fast because there's 32 weapons, by the way, is the Halberd, or Scythe weapon class. Sickle weapon class? I actually don't remember what it's called, but scythes, like the Great Scythe, an Oddsbox Scythe, stuff like that. I think these are one of the best weapons against her. They have the same sort of attack style as Great Swords a lot of the time, except it's a diagonal slash while still having a 4-hit combo. Typically better range, and all of them I think have bleed. If not all but one has bleed. They also have access to some really good unique weapon arts, aka I guess Onsbox weapon art, stuff like that. Good range, 4 damage combo, or 4-hit combo. Pretty good stagger as well. I mean, that's about all you really need. When it comes to defining a good weapon, I think one of the biggest aspects to me is the four hit combo. And this is going to be something that you'll notice throughout the tiers. A lot of the weaker weapons are going to be the ones that do not have a 4-hit combo. All right. Next up is going to be Backhand Blade. Now, I've actually covered two of these. I think they're pretty good in a lot of situations. They are all paired weapons, which actually puts them a little lower typically. It means you can't always push aggression, because if she does her blocking backstep, then you bounce and it puts you in a worse situation than, say, a two-handed weapon. Uh, Beyond that, they have pretty good range and their run attack is good. I think their running R2 is actually better than the running R1, even though the running R1 keeps you in a running stance. Uh, they do have the highest hit count combo. You're rarely ever going to pull it off. They're really good at applying bleed. Also, the Falx. No, that's not a backhand blade. It's curved sword. Never mind. So, I mean, yeah. They're decently long and very fast and very light. It's pretty good. Next up, we're going to have the Beast Claw weapon class. Personally, I'm going to call them situational at best. They're still very good against her at times, but the thing is, the R1 and R2 are practically unusable against her. In terms of you get one set of R1s or one R2 off, which means you're not ever really utilizing the full advantage of the weapon with high combo strings and high quick bleed build up, even though you can't make it bleed on the Bear Claw at least. The Savage Claw weapon art ends up being very good and combos her completely, assuming you hit her when she's not in armor. That's really good, but most of the other aspects are just fine. Whereas if you were to use, say, like the next weapon, which is going to be the claws, I think these are always great. It's very similar in design, except that the R1s don't have such a long startup on them, and they have better range. So you end up getting all of the aspects of the Beast Claw in the claw instead, but you also get better range, and you don't have to worry about the combos as much. And you stagger on all your R1s, which is always good. They're really good at applying bleed. They always stagger. You do have the option of poison. I don't really know why you would use that against Malenia. She has like 1500 poison resistance base. But even with that, the Serpent Claw, the Serpent Fang, still poisons her rather fast. So I think they're always good, and it's another weapon class that usually comes with bleed. That's pretty good. After that, we have Colossal Swords. These are situational at best as well, I'm going to say. So this is where you get into a weapon that has the 3-hit combo. Those are typically just worse against her. Well, for my playstyle at least, you have to use a very poke and retreat strategy, which is letting her take control of the battle, which I think is something that a lot of people do, and you really don't have to do with her. But with a 3-hit moveset, you can't interrupt usually if she side dodges to the left, counterclockwise, around you. It's really hard to time it for you get one R1 delay and get a second R1 to interrupt that. Whereas instead with a 4-hit combo, you can do 2 R1s and the third one is slightly delayed. On top of that, the bonus damage compared to a greatsword or something of a similar weapon, or of a similar size to that, is maybe 10 to 20% more, but it's a lot harder to land a large number of hits. And in NG7, which is where I do all of my fighting with her, you end up having, she ends up having very high posture. So poise breaking her only happens, it happens about half as often, right? So it takes like 2 to 4 hits, I think, if you're using charged R2s especially, in base NG to stance break her with a colossal weapon. With this, in NG7 though, that you're bumping up to 5 to 6 hits with charged R2s. And, well, with a single charged R2 in there, I guess. Which ends up being a little harder to use. Next up, we have Colossal Weapons instead of Colossal Swords. I think this is possibly one of the worst weapon classes for her. I'm gonna put it and pick a different weapon. The difference you have over Colossal Swords and this is the fact that it is typically a vertical move set with a terrible charged R2. You have a very overhead R2, or you have a side sweeping R2, which is actually pretty good, but it's one of your usable moves. The rolling attack is not good for her. It has very little reach and does standard damage, so you're not getting much out of it, whereas with a Colossal Sword, you get a thrusting R2 most of the time, or thrusting roll attack, which is incredibly good against her, as thrusting attacks with good range can make up a lot of your damage very easily. Weapon arts are typically kind of lacking as well. They do good damage, but are usually really high risk for the mediocre reward. And they're really heavy too. You have some exceptions like the sunflower in the picture, for example, but that one's also holy. So while it might be on the lighter end, you're giving up 40% of your damage, 40% of your holy damage, 10% of your strike damage to handle that. All right. After that, we have got curved greatswords. Now this one would probably go in always great. Curved greatswords end up having, again, it's the sweet spot of 4 attacks at a time. 4 attack combo, plus good sweeping attacks, meaning that if she is trying to circle strafe you, it's really hard for her to get around you. On top of that, you still get access to the good greatsword type weapon art, stuff like Lion's Claw, things like that. And you even have Freya's greatsword in here, which buffs Lion's Claw. That's actually the picture that I used, is Freya's greatsword. You can get some good ones with Bleed. They always have Frost. They have good base multipliers for these effects too. So it's really hard to miss out on anything with that. I think they're very strong, and they make quick work of her in general. It was actually the first weapon I did was the Beastman's cleaver, the curved greatsword one. That thing, I remember I died a few times. It wasn't bad. I was worse at the time, is what it came down to. Up next, though, we have curved swords. This one is weird because while curved swords are really strong, if you're comparing them in power to their other locations, compared to other weapons as well here, I'm gonna say honestly situational at best. The paired moveset is good, but again, you're giving up a paired moveset instead of a greatsword, or two-handed moveset, so you're losing out on easy staggers and easy no deflection, and she backs up. It's also kind of hard to hit the full jump attack on her, so you're losing a lot of efficiency with a lot of your attacks against her, to the point where I don't really think it's worthwhile, when if you're already speccing into Dex or Faith, whatever it is you're using, you could pick a different weapon that's slightly larger, making use of the full moveset of the weapon instead of 1 to 2 attacks. Like, for example, it's a 6-hit combo. It's very rare for you to ever see the light where you can actually land a 6-hit combo. Let's see. Next up after that is daggers. Now I have this parry her column, even though I don't ever parry Malenia, because I think it's just the suboptimal way of fighting her. It's much more difficult to parry her instead of just, like, fighting her close combat style. I have beaten her with, like, 1 dagger. Typically, not a big fan of them. No, it's actually 2 or 3 daggers, but the ones that I've used, Reduvia, Cincada, however you would pronounce it, I don't use the thrusting moveset on it. So there are 3 different R2s on daggers, and it's important that it's R2s, because the R1s on daggers do not stagger her in 1 hit, making it difficult to actually push aggression with them. But the thrusting R2 ends up being incredibly bad and slow. It's slower than the slashing R2, which makes it really hard to actually get punishes off in open windows. Where if you were to use something slightly larger, you'd have a similar attack speed as the uncharged R2s of the dagger. But the slashing attack combo, I would call it situational at best, just because it's good enough to handle her on her own. There's just like not a reason to put yourself through that when you could just choose a different weapon, right? So like you could choose something slightly larger that you still have the stats for, and it'll be a lot easier to handle her aggression when you're not having to rely on the. It is a forward, and advancing R2, but you're still limiting your range when you could have just chosen like a greatsword. So I think due to their lack of range and their ineffectiveness with their speed moveset, like with their one-handed moveset, you're not getting the full aspect of the dagger. But you do also have access to Misericord parrying, which is 1.4x crit plus dagger boost, plus you could now, Blade of Mercy, talisman them if you want for even more damage stacking. stuff like that. It's pretty good. I don't know. I think you should probably stick to parrying her with most daggers, but if you don't want to parry her, you do have options like Reduvia and the all of the guns are honestly good because the guns are good anywhere. Talking Blint's or Glintstone, Blade, Chris, and stuff like that. So you have some fantastic unique weapon arts, I will say that. Alright, next up is the dueling shields. These are honestly really good, but with the fix to them back when that happened, they took a bit of a hit there in terms of efficiency, and your poke blocking is already less efficient than just hitting R1s at a proper time, because you're trading and letting her heal. I'm going to put them in situational as, at best, almost, we'll put it, this isn't exactly ordered, but in this case, we'll put it at the front of the line. They're almost as good as the great weapons. In this case, I would say they are just a little bit lacking when you could just use something else. It is nice that you have basically safety frames at the end of your attacks where she really won't be able to kill you, but you're losing out on. I don't know, actually. I might be changing my mind here. So the thing is, you get access to Vow the Indomitable on one weapon. You never have to swap weapons. Actually, that alone, I think, might make me move them up to good in most situations, honestly. Because Vow the Indomitable is a defining weapon art for her fight if you know how to use it properly. It actually completely negates Waterfowl, in the first step at least. Then you roll and you stand still, and it's a very effective dodge. So I think that lets you put it there. On top of that, they have decent range, and they are thrusting damage. Thrusting damage has an innate bonus just because it's really easy to counter hit her if you know how to predict her doing the triple slash attack and the timing for punishing her startup on that. So I think good in most situations is a pretty good spot for it, honestly. On top of that, next up, we have fist weapons. Now, I should have made two categories for fist weapons, because there's an issue. There are two main types of fist weapons. You have the Star Fist, the Iron Ball, stuff like that, where it's got the unhanded, unarmed moveset, or you've got the longer fist weapons that are bladed and thrusting damage, right? I'm going to say I'm going to put them in always great, but I'm going to put an asterisk on that and say don't ever use the thrusting moveset against her. If you're using fist weapons, just grab a great star if you're trying to use like fist weapons only or something. Otherwise, as long as you're not using the commanders, the veterans prosthesis, I should say, you're honestly good to just use any fist weapon. It's just one side of the fist weapon moveset way landslide out scales the other. So you've got things like the Star Fist, which already has bleed. It has incredibly high charge R2 damage with really fast charged R2s, giving you stance breaks incredibly fast at really high damage numbers already. It's really hard to turn that down when it ends up being possibly one of the strongest movesets in the entire game for any situation always. I would honestly say it probably is the best. Alright. Next up we have Flails. Now this is basically if hammers couldn't be blocked by her backstepping. The only issue I have with it, I'm going to put it in situational at best. I've noticed some wonky things in her AI with it. I don't really know if it's because I'm using a flail or what, but she typically plays a little bit differently when I fight her with a flail. It's not necessarily, like, super noticeable, but she'll end up just... She ends up repeating moves more often, and I found things just really kind of awkward, but I think that's probably just anecdotal data, rather than actually being about flails. The issue with flails is that there's very few of them, but they do mostly have bleed, but you're really giving up a lot of range to use them, and the damage for that is not very good. When again, you could just use a great weapon that is honestly similar stagger power and stuff. Greater stagger power, honestly. So short range, high speed moveset, kind of lacking weapon arts, and kind of underdeveloped weapon in general. There's so few of them that you don't really have much choice. Next up, we've got the Great Katanas. There's only 3 of them, but unsurprisingly, they're all kind of insane, and they're all incredibly good. So, with the Great Katanas, you have an overhead R1 and then a poke for an R2. The poke ends up being a little worse on Malenia than other bosses because she's really good at sidestepping it. But if you do land it, it is a thrust attack that also has really high damage motion values. I don't know why. It seems to be higher than average. I think it's really good. You have really good reach, so you don't have to worry about her outranging you so badly. You could easily push advantage with your R1s. They're slightly forward advancing. They all get bleed, at least 45. Granted, I think, yeah, only the base Great Katana can be turned occult or bleed. But 45 bleed is still more than 0, and that lets you get at least 2 to 3 bleed procs on her throughout the fight. And that's going to make a huge difference in whittling her down quickly. Next up, we have Great Spears. Now, maybe this is just bias, but from my experience, I'm going to put this in the pick a different weapon category. I think Great Spears are kind of terrible against her. You get a 3R1 moveset. They are thrust weapons, so she dodges them easily. You can't interrupt her follow-ups very easily, because again, you get the 3R1s. You do have thrust damage, and you do have good range. Beyond that, though, you don't have much. You have good access to weapon arts like Giant Hunter and stuff like that, but you can't use the Smith script, the Spear of the Impaler. You can't use the R2 for that. That's worthless. The R1s are... You have very few options for Great Spears. Most of them do split damage already, and her elemental resistances are typically good enough, except Fire and Lightning. But Fire and Lightning aren't very used very often with Great Spears. That you're kind of left wondering what to do, right? You do have access to Spear of the Impaler if you're running a Faith build, and access to that weapon art, which ends up blowing the damage out of the water compared to any of the other weapons, but you're still missing out on a lot of the bonuses that just normal great weapons give you. And again, the big one is the 4 damage, the 4 hit moveset. You have a really rough running R2. It's very easy for her to whiff, and if you do the startup of it and hit her with just the first one, she can dodge out of it. The running R1 is decent, but you're getting very similar to range, honestly, as to something like the heavy thrusting swords. So I think overall it's just a lacking weapon where you could just choose a heavy thrusting sword if you want thrust damage, or you can choose a great sword if you want the great stagger. Next up we have great axes. I think great axes rank higher than most of the other great weapons. Although, I mean, honestly, great katanas are up here, scythes are up here, which I kind of count them in the same speed as great weapons, and spoilers, not much to say about it, but great swords are going to be up here as well. Anyway, great axes are basically the same idea as great hammers, except they are longer, they have better stagger, they have better charged R2s, they get an unlisted bonus to their charged R2 damage, and they're just all around better. You have access to things like the Executioner's Great Axe, which you trade off maybe 5 to 10% damage when at like soft caps, in exchange for 15% bonus crit damage. You get the same kinds of weapon arts typically. It is basically anything that a Great Hammer did, this thing does better. Except for the fact that it has standard or slash damage. I think it's mostly standard instead of strike damage, but Malenia is equal on all of her physical resistances, so that doesn't really matter. Next up we have Greatswords. It is, I think, the best of the best weapon classes against her. It is as standard as it gets, as long as you're using the normal R1, two-handed R1 moveset that is just overhead, then swinging up, then down, then up. It's about as good as it gets. You have access to all different kinds of weapons. You have access to all different kinds of utility. You get frostbite, you get bleed. It has a very large range of pools of weapon arts. You can basically customize them how you need, whether it be range or damage or whatever. There are just so many great swords. They cover so many different niches that I think they cover anything you could ever need against Malenia. Not only that, as you can see, I have the Lizard Greatsword here. The Lizard Greatsword ends up being really good because it has an R2, unlike the Smith script weapons, that has infinite, or not infinite, but it has really good range compared to Smith script weapons, and it has a higher standard poise damage compared to Smith script weapons. So you can actually poke at her from long range and get decent pokes out of it. Very good weapon class. It's hard to compete with, honestly. As you can see, there's a trend that I'm showing where I think, honestly, most weapon classes are good against her. And I'm going to say that, yes, honestly, most weapons are good against her once you learn to fight her. Uh, so it's really hard to go wrong with choosing what you want, but just know that some of them have more advantages. And I say that because this next one is the Halberd class. There are 2 or 3 movesets with that, and all of them are honestly just good. I said just good, so let me just put it in good in most situations, and honestly. The thing is, you do have access to like Commander Standard, if for some reason you're limiting yourself based on just weapon arts of the weapon class you're using for some reason. But I don't know why you'd do that. You have a thrusting moveset which lets you do the counter poking of great spears, but better. You have a more overhead moveset which is very similar to that of a greatsword, but with a sweep as the follow-up, which makes it really easy to punish her her side swipes, her side jumps and stuff. Very good overall. I think it's hard to go wrong choosing Halberd. You have access to one of the strongest weapons in the game, being the Dragonkin. What is it even called? The Dragon Halberd or whatever. So it has Spinning Slash that gives you a bonus to frost and electric damage, lightning damage. That ends up being one of the best weapon arts against her and one of the highest damage outputs against her. Alright, actually, I've convinced myself I'm going to put it in always great now. I did it. Alright. You got me. Alright. Next up, we have clubs. I think these fall into a very similar niche as axes. Kind of shorter range, faster moveset. It's kind of, actually, I'm going to put it the opposite way of how great axes and great hammers work. Because you get access to the stone club, which ends up being as high damage as like a great hammer or great axe on R1s with like Cragblade and stuff, and has a really good attack speed and moveset. Whereas axes have a lot of the similar properties, but they just don't have something like the stone club, something quite as dominating in physical damage that also only requires repetitive as much, but only requires one stat, in this case strength for the stone club. They are a little lacking in range, and they have a very vertical moveset. If you're using the stone club style, or like the flowerstone gavel, which I recently posted, I think that those, they have really good damage, but they're kind of difficult to use because you're having less than great damage, right? You're having the straight sword club axe normal range of damage, which is going to be like 20% less or even 30% less than a great sword at times, and that really starts making the fight drag on, and it means you're opening yourself up for more time for mistakes. After that, we have heavy thrusting swords. I think these are some of the best weapons in the game as well. Wow, who would have guessed? I'm very biased towards the medium weight class weapons. To the point where I think besides great hammers, I think they all do go in there, honestly. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I completely would say so. Uh Heavy thrusting swords make up for the fact that it being thrusting, for the fact that it has a running R2 that is stronger than almost any other weapons in the game. Running R2s already have higher base damage than most. It reaches much further than that of like a spear or even a great spear. It can reach as far as a great spear, but you don't have the multi-hit run R2 unless you're using Gaius's. But that one's a little unique for a bunch of reasons. Beyond that, you have good status build up if you make it frost or bleed, poison technically, but you really shouldn't for Malenia. And you get thrusting damage, but you actually make good use of the moveset because everything staggers her easily, and you get the 4+ attacks, meaning that you don't have to worry about the Great Spear's downsides. Is basically if the Great Spear was good against her, is how that plays, really. Next up is katanas. These are really good too. This is my issue. I want to put like everything in the always great category, but I'm actually going to put it in good in most situations, but at the top of that class, because It really does work in a lot of situations. The only downside is unless you're running Naga Kiba, which gives up a decent chunk of damage, you're a little lacking in range. So it makes a difference. You do always have access to bleed though, and you have one of the better two-handed lighter weapon movesets. I'm still gonna put it in good at best, good in most situations. It is by no means situational because you always have access to bleed, and you have access to split damage if you need, and some unique, really good weapon arts. Honestly, Unsheath on its own is good enough to carry you through the fight. So I'm gonna put it in great or in good. My bad. Beyond that, we have up next is the light greatsword. This is about as light as medium weapons get. That's very silly to say. It is one of the best categories of weapon as well. Actually, I might put it in good at best, solely for the fact that there's only one good light greatsword, so only a third of the category is good against Malenia. Because you have lead as greatsword, but that only does 40. It has 40% wholly reduced damage, and then you have Rolana's twin swords, which are basically just a straight sword, because the paired light greatsword moveset is leagues worse than just hitting R2 than R1 with a two-handed greatsword, or light greatsword. You have really good range. You have good stagger. You have good like pressure building. It's really hard for her to escape you hitting R2, R1, and then if she backdashes, you just do a running R2 and catch her again. It's really easy to push pressure with this weapon. There's really not much to say besides just say, like, if you take a Cold Milady in there, she will probably die. But Cold Milady basically conquers the entire game on its own. After that, we have martial arts. This one's tough because martial arts are purely defined by their weapon art, in case of if you want to call them always great, which I think means that they're not always great. The R1s and R2s are not unusable, but say you're using Dane's footwork, she treats the R2s as projectiles, meaning she will purposefully armor through them if you're even close. Meaning you can't use R2s. R1s are pretty good and they stagger well. A little worse than claws, but better than bear claws in that situation. The weapon art, though, can carry you completely without much thinking at all. But I think that alone kind of doesn't really give the full picture of the weapon's utility, right? Because if you're just going in there spamming L2 until you get the win, there's a lot of weapon classes that can do that as well. Eventually it will work. Perfumer bottles are next. I'm unsure. I'm more likely to say situational at best than pick a different weapon. But I'm also biased towards perfumer bottles. I really like them. You gotta think you have fire, lightning, frost, you have madness, and then you have poison. So of the 5 that you have, you can use 3 of them very effectively. Ooh, that's a good point. And frostbite one is actually really good. She takes 20% reduced magic damage, so you have an innate 20% damage debuff, but you also have access to frost, which is her lowest resistance, as well as access to some really good weapon arts against her. You have Wall of Sparks, which is usually not the one people talk about, but it catches her on side dodges pretty easily, especially if you don't charge it. So I think it's a good choice. I think it ends up being very strong against her. The range can be deceptive at times because the hitbox lingers a little. And in this case, lunging is good that it doesn't have it. It doesn't have forward movement on its R1s because of the fact that it lingers, so she can walk into those hitboxes. Like she'll swing into it and hit herself effectively. And I think that's very good, but something that's hard to kind of make good use of until you get a very strong understanding of how the fight works. Next we have, I almost said torches. These are actually, I used the torch pole picture, but this is spears. I'm also going to call them situational at best. You get thrust damage, and it's better than a great spear, but it has like all the same issues besides the fact that you get more pokes. There's a lot of spears in the weapon category that are just bad, is part of it, but they are fine overall. Uh, I just think you'd be better off using a medium weapon or something that hits harder and doesn't rely on counter hits as much. The fast moveset's nice, the range is nice, but if you want long range and fast, there is a better option. Surprisingly, we haven't gone over it yet, but we'll get there very soon. There's only a few left. I hope I'm not going through this too fast. I feel like I'm going very fast over all of these, but if you guys want more info on any of these, just feel free. Hit me up in the comments or something, and I'll kind of explain my reasoning some more. Next up, we have straight swords. I'm going to say these are... I'm tempted to put them in pick a different weapon. Straight swords I really like against Malenia, but everything that they do is way outclassed by anything else. The speed that they have is not necessary. They get 6 hits per combo, but you don't need 6. 5 is good enough. And clubs and hammers and axes already do that, on top of the fact that the two-handed moveset is bad, so you don't really want to be two-handing them. You can pair them, but that's typically just worse in general, usually. You have access to standard weapon arts, you have access to Cragblade, you have access to some unique rot options and stuff, but again, she's super resistant to rot, but 1 or 2 rots, it does still help along the way. You get mediocre range. Honestly, I think I'm going to put it in pick a different weapon. I think they're bad enough that I don't think that you should be using them most of the time. If you're wanting to use a straight sword or something like a straight sword with a similar feel, I would switch to a katana instead and make use of its benefits while also having the better range, slightly better moveset, and not having to worry so much about, like, you're losing out on like 10 or 15% damage swapping to a straight sword. And the big R1 mashing doesn't quite work against her because she can choose to armor through things. Next up, we have the throwing weapons moveset, of which there is only one. The throwing daggers. I'm just going to put that and pick a different weapon, and beyond that, I'm going to say these are very much so not a weapon for fighting bosses, typically in general. This is more so a weapon for utility, baiting out enemies and things like that without using FP, and they're very difficult to use against her, and I don't think they're ever very good against her. I don't have much else to say. They buffed the range on them, but even still, they're really hard to use. Your best option is just the running R2, which is just kind of lame. You just don't get to experience much of the fight with her that way. It's a really difficult weapon to use against her and not really worth anybody's time. I wish I could say more because I love the weapon class, but they just don't do enough. Alright, anyway though, next up is thrusting swords. Now, I have been lying to you this whole time. I'm going to have edited it in post, but let's just say, I'll just say this, I've never actually beaten her with a thrusting sword. Even though I have beaten her 100+ times, 85 times on video, on recording for you guys, and then just through random playthroughs as well. I have fought her more than 15 times there. I think thrusting swords might be just the worst weapon class for her. You can use the parry strategy, so I'm going to put it in parry her, but, like, even still, it's just sad, right? So you have your R1s that do not stagger. You have the same issue as daggers. Your R2s are the same issue as daggers in being the thrusting moveset. However, they are slower than daggers, and you're not getting much damage out of it anyway. So you don't have good counter poking for her. You can't shield poke. You don't get R1s. The paired moveset's really bad. You don't get very good weapon arts, but you do get access to, like, some of the ones that greatswords have, like, the multiple thrust one. Beyond that, I mean, like, you get statuses. Well, like, other weapons do statuses better anyway. There's really nothing going for it outside of, like, generic weapon arts that any weapon can use and make use of. So I think they are the bottom of the barrel. Only thing worse than them is the daggers, the throwing daggers. And that's the only weapon in that category, whereas thrusting swords have dozens of weapons. At least a dozen weapons. Next up is torches. I adore the torches. However, I'm going to put them in pick a different weapon. They're a pain to use. They do fine damage, but you basically have to use the running R2. The R1s don't stagger. In phase 2, you can use the R1s to mash on her after she does her jump attacks. But you're really just giving up DPS to use a torch, which is just silly, and there's no real reason to do that unless you're just trying to show off, right? They're fine. They just do below average damage, but you can still buff them up to reasonable damage, is the thing to think about, right? Like, you still get straight sword or so damage, you just have a worse moveset. That's all it is. Alright, we are down to the last two weapons, as you can probably see. Next up is going to be Twin Blades. Twin Blades here. I think they are... I'm going to put them in situational at best, and this is because the two-handed moveset is just... It's the one that you're supposed to want to use with Twin Blades, but it comes out being worse in those situations. It has some really fun weapons like the Godskin Peeler and the Euphoria, but they struggle to actually find a niche, right? You would think it's status build up, but due to how two-handed multi-hit moves work, you get like a 0.3 times multiplier on your first hit, so it's slightly higher than normal status build up, but still not anything amazing because they have lower base status build up. They don't have very good poise pressure, stuff like that. I think typically it's a lot of extra work when you could, if you just one hand, you get basically the moveset of like a katana or so sort of speed. And that's really all you need. Like, the main aspect of the weapon gets completely negated by the fact, just due to how Malenia fights you, which kind of makes it kind of sad. So I'm putting it in situational at best. And the last weapon we have is the whip. Now, besides the fact that the magma candlestick exists, I think whips absolutely rule against her, and we're actually going to put them... This isn't exactly an ordered tier list, but if it was, we can reorder them a little. But, they're pretty high up there, I'll say that. Yeah, probably something like that, middle of the top tier. They're very good. Uh, Things like Arumi, it outranges her in such an awesome degree, in like a literal sense of awesome. Like, she cannot compete with Arumi because it outranges her slashes, which means you can just hit R1 on her and not respect her unless she is actively forcing armor on you. So you don't play by her rules at all to such a degree that it's probably more powerful than a lot of the other weapons, besides the fact that, like, the other weapons just work in every situation. It's hard to say, right? I don't know, I'm finding hard to find the wording for it, but basically, you lose out on crits is the big issue, right? You get low stance pressure, but you still poise break her per hit, like you still stagger her every hit. But you don't get crits anyway. You lose access to some really good weapon arts, not being a blade. But you also have Arumi and things with higher range than Arumi even, meaning that she can't even put pressure on you when you're using those weapons. And I think that about does it. This has been a very fun video to make. I'm just kind of letting my thoughts fly for this one. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly and too all over the place. I feel like it might have been, but I feel like I put a lot of good thoughts into this at the same time. Just kind of barely touched on every weapon. Beyond that, let me know what you guys think in the description. If you want a link to the tier list, let me know. I'll put it in the description as well, if anybody asks about it, I guess. I made this one myself. As you can see, I think most weapons are actually just good against her in general. There's a few that I would probably avoid, but very, very few weapons would I not just use against her if I was just doing it for a playthrough. This is the end of the video. I'm gonna ask you guys, please, if you enjoy, leave a like if you enjoyed it. Comment if you have any feedback for this, or if you guys think I'm wrong in any way, please. I'd love to have discussions in the comment section. Subscribe if you want to hear more of this sort of stuff. I'm thinking of doing like some top 10s type videos. I kind of want to try out with that sort of thing. See what I can figure out. Beyond that, I don't have it in the beginning as of recording this, but I'm going to be editing in a part of why I feel like I'm qualified enough to make this tier list. And then that's about it. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I will talk to you guys later. Bye. Thank you so much.